Hello everyone. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it there? Now, close your eyes and listen closely to The Case of the Widow's Ledger. Section 1. The Letter from Glemswood. It was on a bitterly cold morning in late February of 1893 that I returned to Baker Street after tending to a minor surgical consultation in South Kensington. The sky was low and grey, a fog rolling in off the Thames with a density that muted even the clatter of the horse-drawn cabs. I was surprised to find Holmes already up, dressed in his grey frock coat, seated cross-legged in his armchair before a fire that had burned nearly to cinders. A sealed envelope lay on the mantelpiece, and as I stepped inside, Holmes gestured toward it, with that peculiar twitch of his eyebrows that usually signified a case had arrived. "Something interesting?" I asked as I shrugged off my coat. "Possibly," Holmes murmured, never lifting his eyes from the letter. "A communication from a Mrs. Lydia Parish of Glemswood-on-Hay, a village so obscure, Watson, that it does not appear in the latest gazetteer." I moved to the fire, warming my hands. "And what troubles this hidden hamlet?" Holmes leaned forward and passed me the letter. The paper was cheap, but the handwriting elegant, a fine, angular cursive that hinted at classical education and perhaps the remnants of wealth now gone. "Mr. Holmes, I fear my husband's death was no natural thing despite the inquest's declaration. Since that terrible morning, I have come to suspect that I am watched, that his affairs were not his own, and that the account ledger he so closely guarded holds more than mere sums. There are whispers among the staff, strange symbols in his old diaries, and a key to a drawer that no longer exists. I beg of you, if discretion allows, come to Glemswood before the ledger disappears. Lydia Parish." When I looked up, Holmes was already rising. "I've sent for the carriage. Pack light, Watson. We shall dine in the Midlands." Glemswood-on-Hay lay nestled between two ancient ridges of wood. The village a small crescent of stone cottages, moss-covered walls, and crumbling wells that dated back to the Norman conquest. The parish estate was no manor, but a fine country home of mid-Georgian construction, adorned with ivy and framed by towering elms. It stood alone on the northern edge of the village, bordering the abandoned grounds of a former priory. We were met by Mrs. Parish in the foyer, a tall, grave woman of perhaps 40. She was dressed in full mourning, her black crepe veil drawn back to reveal high cheekbones and pale eyes that seemed almost colourless in the grey light. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her voice barely more than a whisper. Holmes bowed. "You mentioned your late husband's ledger. I presume it is still in your possession." She led us to the study, an oak-panelled room reeking of pipe smoke and musty vellum. Upon the desk was the ledger in question, a thick, leather-bound volume with no title on its spine. The pages, however, were not numbers and entries as one might expect, but instead odd sequences, partial names, geographical coordinates, and what looked suspiciously like ciphered phrases. "What sort of business was your husband involved in?" Holmes asked. Mrs. Parish paused. "He was a book collector and a patron of research. He often corresponded with archaeologists and historians. I did not pry into the specifics." Holmes turned a page. "And what is this drawer you mentioned in your letter?" Mrs. Parish nodded toward the built-in cabinet behind the desk. "That bottom compartment, it once had a lock. The drawer itself seems to have vanished, as if it was never there." Holmes was on his knees in an instant, examining the space with his magnifying glass. He ran his fingers along the frame, then produced a slender blade and gently pried loose a panel. A faint hiss of air escaped. Inside, buried in dust, was a small brass cylinder, sealed with wax, bearing a sigil of crossed serpents and the initials TCR. That evening, we were given rooms on the second floor overlooking the overgrown garden. Holmes spent much of the night with the ledger and the brass capsule, poring over its curves, tapping gently at the seal. As I prepared to turn in, he looked up. "Watson," he said softly, "do you know of the Rosicrucians? A secret society, isn't it? Renaissance mystics and alchemists." "More than mystics," he replied, "and older than most suppose. If I am correct, Mr. Parrish was entangled in something deeper than academic correspondence. These symbols," he tapped a page in the ledger, "are almost certainly tied to the Rosicrucian cipher alphabet." He turned the page. "And this coordinate," he murmured, "places us not far from the abandoned priory just east of the estate. Then, perhaps tomorrow—" But before I could finish, a knock came at the door. Mrs. Parrish entered, her face pale as linen. "Forgive the hour," she said, trembling, "but I believe someone has broken into the old wine cellar." Holmes led the way down the servants' staircase, candle in hand. The air grew colder as we descended. At the base, a rough-hewn door had been left ajar. Inside, overturned bottles, broken glass, and something far stranger. A pile of soil, black, damp, recently disturbed. Buried beneath it, just peeking out the corner of another ledger, smaller, but bound in the same leather as the first. Holmes brushed it clean and opened the cover. Inside, a single phrase written in a hurried, unsteady hand. "The order will return. The key is not in the drawer. It is in the bones." Section 2. Whispers in the Cryptwood. We returned from the cellar in silence, Holmes carrying the smaller ledger beneath his arm. Mrs. Parrish offered no further words, only a haunted glance before retreating to her room. Holmes remained seated at the desk until the first glimmer of dawn crept over the garden wall. The phrase, "the key is in the bones," weighed heavily on both our minds. "Symbolic?" I offered when I brought him his tea. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, not lifting his eyes. "But in this case, Watson, I suspect it is disturbingly literal." He turned the second ledger toward me. The first few pages were notes, disjointed thoughts, partial diagrams, names like Meister Albrecht, Lucien Dussel, and Carwin the Pale. Then, a sketch of a key, not made of metal, but shaped like a spinal vertebra, etched with tiny markings that mirrored those in the Rosicrucian cipher. "Parrish wasn't just a collector," Holmes said. "He was attempting something, or uncovering something ancient." He looked up. "We must visit the priory ruins immediately." We set out across the fields behind the estate, boots sinking into frostbitten grass. The priory, long abandoned and half swallowed by creeping vines, loomed ahead like the skeleton of some petrified cathedral. Its arches were broken, its roof collapsed, but the bell tower still stood, tall, crooked, and shrouded in mist. Holmes examined the foundation stones as we entered. "There," he said, pointing to a faint sigil carved into the lintel. "Two concentric circles surrounding a triangle and a serpent." I shivered. "You recognize it?" He nodded. "It predates Christianity, older even than Druidic symbols. It was used by certain Rosicrucian sects to denote hidden knowledge, specifically the location of reliquaries." "A reliquary?" He turned to me. "A container of sacred remains, bones, Watson." Inside the priory, the earth floor was uneven, choked with brambles and tree roots. At the centre stood the remnants of a stone altar, now cracked through and dusted with leaves. Holmes walked the perimeter slowly, tapping at the stones, listening. He stopped near the eastern wall. "One of these stones is not like the others," he murmured. "Notice the scent. Slightly metallic. Iron oxide. This slab was moved recently." With effort, we shifted the stone aside. Beneath it was a wooden trapdoor, rotten at the edges but still sealed with a heavy lock. Holmes pulled from his coat a narrow metal pick and a length of wire. "Do keep an ear out," he said, kneeling beside it. "It would be inconvenient to be murdered by mystics before lunch." The lock gave with a satisfying click. We opened the hatch. Below, a narrow spiral staircase of stone descending into blackness. We descended, lantern in hand, into a vault that seemed untouched by time. The air grew colder. At the base, a large chamber opened out, its walls carved with glyphs, triangles, stars, suns, all intertwined with serpents. Shelves lined the walls, holding old urns, books wrapped in waxed cloth, and more bones than I care to remember. At the centre stood a plinth, and upon it a human skull, embedded into the cranium, a key made of gold and bone, fused to the forehead like a third eye. Holmes approached carefully. There it is, the key in the bones. He wrapped it in cloth and placed it into his satchel. I turned to survey the walls, heart still pounding, and found a rusted plaque bolted to the stone. I brushed off the grime. It read, "Sanctum of the Red Circle. Keeper, Parish, Elias, 1861 to 1893. "My God," I whispered, "the same parish?" Holmes nodded grimly. Our Lydia's late husband, it seems, was not merely a collector of ancient knowledge. He was its guardian, or perhaps its prisoner. We returned to the house in silence. Mrs. Parish greeted us at the threshold, already pale and paler still when she saw the satchel in Holmes's grip. "Was it down there?" she asked. Holmes gave a slight nod. "It was. Your husband's name is inscribed in the vault. He was a keeper of something called the Red Circle." She swallowed hard. "He never told me." "Would he have dared?" She led us into the drawing room and poured herself a measure of brandy. "Elias was always quiet, kind but distant. He spent hours in the library, pages and pages of symbols. At first I thought it harmless obsession. But then the visitors began." "Visitors?" She nodded. "Men who arrived at dusk. They never gave names. Some foreign. One of them wore a coat with a silver chain over his collar. I saw a tattoo on his wrist, some kind of sunburst with an eye." Holmes's face darkened. "I've seen that mark before," he said, "in a case that nearly cost me my life. It belongs to a sect of Rosicrucians known as Ordo Sanguinis Aurum, the Order of the Golden Blood." "Charming," I muttered. "They believe enlightenment lies through the unmaking of identity, that the self must be dismantled through ritual and memory suppression. They wear masks not to hide, but to forget who they are." "And this key?" Holmes turned it gently in his hand. "It likely opens whatever door Elias Parish sealed before his death." Mrs. Parish trembled. "And if someone else wants to open it?" Holmes met her gaze. "Then they will come for this house, and for you." That night, the fog deepened. The house seemed to shrink under the weight of unseen pressure. Holmes and I took turns sleeping in the study. I awoke near dawn to the sound of tapping glass. Holmes was already standing at the window. "There," he said softly. Across the field, a figure in a dark coat, standing, watching, not moving, a mask upon his face. Section 3. The Man in the Mask. We stood frozen at the window, the frost-speckled glass obscuring some of the stranger's features. but not the most damning detail: the mask. Not a theatrical mask, nor one of mourning or ceremonial pomp, but a smooth, featureless oval, bone-white and expressionless. It caught no light, as if it consumed it. The figure stood just beyond the hedgerow that bordered the old orchard. Though he did not move, I could feel his presence pressing against the house like a storm front. Holmes was already dressed and halfway to the door before I could reach for my coat. "You're going out there?" I called after him. "Not for long," he said. "If he means us harm, he's not here to deliver it now. This is reconnaissance, Watson. He wants to be seen." I followed him across the frost-hardened field, our boots crunching in rhythm. The wind had picked up, scattering crows from the treetops. The figure remained motionless. But as we drew within 20 yards, he turned and disappeared into the orchard without a sound. We gave chase. The orchard was a tangle of gnarled branches and overgrown roots, but the snow gave him away. Footprints, shallow but direct, leading through a break in the stone wall and onto the road beyond. Holmes knelt by a patch of disturbed earth and lifted something half-buried, a scrap of parchment, damp and yellowed. Upon it, inked in a precise and ancient hand, "The circle is never broken, only turned." Holmes's brow furrowed. "He's not just a courier," he muttered. "He's a member. They've chosen to make contact." "Why now?" "Because we've found the key." We returned to the house by a longer path, ensuring we weren't being followed. Mrs. Parrish greeted us with a telegram in her hand. "It arrived while you were gone," she said. "No sender." Holmes read the single line aloud: "Lectori salutem. The rite begins on the equinox. Return the key, or let the widow burn." Mrs. Parrish went white. I took her by the arm, but she did not flinch. Holmes looked at the fire, face grim. "We've 3 days," he said. "That's when the equinox falls this year." "To do what?" "To unlock whatever Parrish hid, and to use it before they do." That evening we pored over the 2 ledgers again, comparing symbols. Holmes deciphered more of the text using a 16th century Latin substitution method, paired with astrological charts. What emerged chilled me. Parrish had indeed been a keeper, charged with guarding what he called the Eye of Resurgence, some form of relic or manuscript stored beneath a vault. But as the years passed, his writings grew unstable. "I have seen myself in the glass, but he wore my bones. They say identity is clay. I say it is ash, fleeting, and too easily scattered." The final entry was barely legible. "The guest comes at dusk. If he takes the key, we are all hollow." Holmes finally pieced together a second map, encoded in the margins, coordinates triangulated from symbols embedded in the priory walls and matched to nearby ruins. "The location is due west," he said. "There's an abandoned ossuary hidden in Cripwood Forest. That's where the final door lies." "Door to what?" "Parrish called it a reliquary. I believe it is more than that." He looked at me seriously. "I believe it may contain the identities of those the circle has erased." We set out at first light, the forest dark and dense even under the sun. The mossy trails wound tight through birch and alder, and the air was heavy with decay. After nearly an hour of walking, Holmes stopped and gestured toward a stone outcrop camouflaged by ivy. We uncovered a sealed slab marked only by the same serpent triangle sigil we had seen in the priory. Holmes took out the key, bone and gold gleaming under the morning light, and slid it into the slot. The door opened with a hiss. Inside was a staircase that spiraled downward, carved into the earth. Unlike the priory vault, this was pristine, maintained, preserved. At the bottom stood a chamber ringed in tall mirror-like panels, each carved from obsidian and etched with concentric glyphs, but there were no reflections. The room swallowed light. At the centre was a pedestal, on it a sealed urn. Holmes approached with slow reverence. "Not ashes," he whispered, "memories." He turned to me. "They've stored fragments of identity, names, roles, even thoughts, a library of lives stripped away by the circle." He touched the urn. The chamber pulsed. I heard voices, not loud, but thousands of them, like echoes from other rooms of the mind. Holmes stumbled back, clutching his head. "I saw someone else's life," he gasped. "Children I've never had, a war I never fought, a name I've never known." "They're inside it," he nodded, "and it's growing." We resealed the chamber and fled the vault. Back at the estate, Holmes locked the key away in a lead box. Mrs. Parrish, upon hearing what we'd found, simply whispered, "It killed him, didn't it?" Holmes hesitated. "Number It emptied him." He looked at the fire and his voice dropped. "The circle wants the urn because it gives them power over memory. They erase identities and replace them, become others, the perfect masks, the perfect lies." "Can we destroy it?" Holmes shook his head. "Not yet. First, we must let it tell us who they've taken." At midnight, Holmes placed the lead box on the table and opened the lid. The key glowed faintly in the candlelight. He turned to me. "I will enter the memories," he said. "If I come back, not myself." "You will," I said. "You are Sherlock Holmes." He smiled faintly. "That, Watson, may soon be the only thing I have left." He touched the urn and vanished. Section 4. The Mirror of Names. For several seconds after Holmes touched the urn, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like distant wind funneling through a narrow corridor, the light in the room dimmed, though the candles remained lit. His body shivered once, then stilled. His eyes opened wide, unfocused. He was no longer seeing the room. I approached carefully. "Holmes?" No response. His breathing had slowed, but not dangerously. His fingers rested lightly on the table. He remained upright, but something was gone. His consciousness, perhaps, drawn into the urn's interior. I could do nothing but wait. 28 minutes passed. Then Holmes blinked. He exhaled deeply and clutched his own forearm as though to anchor himself. "I was not alone," he said hoarsely. He drank half a tumbler of brandy before speaking again. "I saw through 1,000 eyes, remembered lives not mine. I felt emotions too vivid to fabricate. They've stored entire personalities inside that vessel." I sat down across from him. "Can you identify them?" Holmes looked toward the window, where fog had begun to creep once more across the panes. "One of them was a child who lived in Prague in the 1700s. Another, a revolutionary who disappeared from Paris in 1832. But the one I recognized—" He trailed off. "Was Parrish?" "No," Holmes said. "It was me." He let the silence hang for a long moment before explaining. "I saw my own memories, but changed, altered, as though someone had rewritten the script. There were inconsistencies, events I could not have lived, but remembered nonetheless." He stared at the urn on the table. "I believe the circle has already begun copying people, not just removing them, mimicking their personalities, assuming their lives. It is no longer erasure, it is replacement." I stared at him. "Holmes, how can we know? How can I know you're still—" He held up a hand. "Ask me something only I would know." I did. he answered correctly. Twice. Still, a chill ran down my spine. That morning we discovered Mrs. Parrish was gone. Her bed had not been slept in. No note left. No carriage taken. But the front door was open. A single set of tracks led toward the priory path, bare feet in the frost. Holmes followed them until they vanished. No struggle, he said. No signs of a forced exit. She walked out on her own. Sleepwalking. Or summoned. We returned to the study. The urn was still sealed, the key still in the box. But on the ledger, her late husband's ledger, someone had scrawled a single line in ink still damp. She wears his name now. "She's been taken," I said, stunned. Holmes turned away from the desk, jaw tight. "Number, she's been recast. They've rewritten her identity. Someone else is wearing Lydia Parrish, either literally or metaphysically." He paused. "We need to find the circle before the equinox, before they perform the rite." "And what is this rite meant to do?" Holmes tapped the urn. "Unleash every soul inside this vessel, like a plague of minds. If that happens, not only will people lose themselves, but everyone might." He gripped the edge of the table. "I believe that's what they call transcendence." We travelled that evening to a nearby village, where Holmes had arranged a meeting with an antiquarian named Matthias Sedgley, a man whose knowledge of esoteric orders rivaled that of any university. Sedgley lived alone in a library that had once been a chapel. Books, scrolls, and inked maps covered every inch. He welcomed us solemnly. "I feared this day would come," he said, examining the sketch of the urn Holmes had made. "You've found the Mirror of Names." "Is that what they call it?" Sedgley nodded. "It's one of the 4 vessels of identity, the only one known to be active." He pulled a weathered book from a shelf. "They were created by a schism within the Rosicrucians centuries ago. This faction believed the soul was not divine, but data, and thus transferable. They built tools to record, to store, and eventually overwrite." He turned to a page depicting a circle of men in masks. "The red circle began as protectors, but they were infiltrated by the Order of the Golden Blood." Holmes leaned forward. "What is their endgame?" Sedgley hesitated. "To erase individual identity, replace it with the collective will. They believe humanity is sick with selfhood, that only a unified consciousness, one mask for all, will redeem us." We left that meeting chilled to the bone. As we rode back to the estate, Holmes turned to me and said, "They intend to overwrite the world." That night, Holmes examined the urn once more. "I saw something," he said quietly. "A name I didn't recognize. Kestrel, over and over, whispered by dozens of memories inside." "A person?" "Perhaps. Or a title." He leaned forward. "I believe Kestrel is the host for the rite, the one whose body they'll use to release the vessel's contents. If we find them, we may stop the ceremony." We searched Parrish's diary again and found a passage underlined in red. "If I falter, she will be Kestrel, not by blood, but by grief." Holmes stared at it. "Not a stranger," he murmured. "It was always going to be Lydia." Section 5. The Rite of the Hollow Mask. The air had grown heavier by morning, the sky over Glemswood low and yellowing, as if jaundiced by something in the earth itself. Holmes rose before I did, and when I entered the study I found him standing motionless, facing the fire, the urn still in its lead box, but now surrounded by a ring of salt and copper wire. "Precaution," he said without turning. "Against what?" "Contagion," he replied. "Mental, Metaphysical? Perhaps both. I've seen what it can do to the mind, its pull, its mimetic gravity. Lydia may not have been taken in body, but if they've implanted her with someone else's essence... He trailed off, his fingers twitching near the mantelpiece. I noticed something new on the desk. A third ledger, smaller, bound in red, waxed leather. I hadn't seen Holmes retrieve it. "You found another?" I asked. He turned slowly. Number It was placed on my bedside table in the night. My stomach dropped. "Is it hers?" Holmes opened the cover. Inside, neat, cursive handwriting. "My name is not my own. He loved me once. Now I wear him like a gown I cannot remove. I'm not Lydia Parrish, but I remember her screaming." We read the entire book aloud that morning. Page after page revealed a transformation of selfhood unraveling, of memories bleeding together, overwritten, rearranged. She spoke of visions of ancient rituals, of a mirror not of glass, but obsidian, where one might trade faces with another. "I am the guest," one entry read, "but they have made me host." Holmes closed the book gently. "We were wrong. She isn't going to become Kestrel, she already is." Our time was running short. The spring equinox would fall in less than 24 hours. Holmes left me briefly to contact Mycroft through a secure telegraph relay. He returned grim. "Mycroft has dispatched a small detachment to monitor the outskirts of Glemswood, but he warns the government cannot act on alchemical intelligence alone. So, we're on our own." He gave a bitter smile. "As ever." That night, we returned to the Priory ruins. The wind had grown sharp, hissing through the branches with an almost deliberate cadence. As we reached the overgrown altar, Holmes stopped. There was someone waiting for us. The figure wore a mask of hammered silver, intricate, inhuman, faceless save for 2 black eye holes. His coat was long, dark and old-fashioned, and he carried no lantern. Holmes stepped forward. "You are of the Order." The figure nodded. "You left the ledger in our rooms?" Another nod. Holmes raised his voice slightly. "Is Lydia still alive?" The masked man finally spoke, his voice dry like paper. "She is dispersed, worn thin. Her vessel is full. The right will bind what is fractured." I stepped beside Holmes. "Bind or destroy?" The man tilted his head. "There is no difference." He held something out, another card. Holmes took it, and the figure turned and vanished into the woods. On the card, coordinates, and a time, 6:06 p.m. Below it, a single line, written in rust-coloured ink. At twilight, we are all unmasked. We followed the coordinates the next morning. They led to an ancient Roman amphitheatre, long buried beneath the edge of the cryptwood forest and covered by ivy. Locals referred to it as the Hollow Ring. Holmes knew of it by reputation only, a place whispered of by antiquarians and folklorists. We arrived early. Holmes examined the central platform, dusting aside vines and soil. There were scorch marks, circular, ritualistic, identical to those described in the diary of a 16th century mystic Holmes once studied. At 5:55 p.m, shadows lengthened. Figures began to appear in the woods. Dozens, all masked, all silent. They stood in a wide ring around the amphitheatre, not speaking, not moving. At 6:06, one stepped forward. Silver masked, tall, and with him a woman in a black veil. Holmes gripped my arm. "Lydia," he whispered. She walked to the centre of the ring, slowly, deliberately. When she removed her veil, I gasped. It was Lydia Parrish, and yet not. Her eyes were too calm, her expression too placid. "I remember you," she said to Holmes, "but you are not my guest." Holmes stepped forward. "What have they done to you?" She smiled faintly. "You're asking the wrong question." "What's the right one?" She turned her eyes to the sky, now burning with the hues of dying day. "Which of us is real?" The silver-masked man raised a staff. The masked acolytes began a low chant, a syllabic rhythm that pulsed with unbearable gravity. My vision blurred. The ground seemed to shimmer. The urn Holmes carried began to vibrate within its box. Holmes stepped forward and opened it. He removed the key. And then he looked back at me. "Watson," he said, his voice steady, "if I do not return, you must burn this place. Salt it. Seal the vault." Before I could stop him, he stepped into the ring. The chanting ceased. Lydia reached for him, and the sky went black. Section 6. The Circle Unbroken. Darkness fell, not like night, but like suffocation. The amphitheatre dissolved from view, the ring of masked figures swallowed into void. I was no longer in Cryptwood. I knew this instinctively, though I stood unmoving, the urn's lead box clenched in my hands like a shield. The only point of reference was Holmes, now encircled by the chanting congregation, Lydia Parrish, at the centre, like an idol, both familiar and unfathomably distant. A great noise gathered in the sky, low like distant thunder, but rhythmic and strange, layered with human breath. Then light, not from above, but from within the circle. A glow emanated from Lydia's chest. Her body convulsed, once, twice, and then her arms opened wide. Her voice rang out, layered with others, a chorus of memory. "We were the child. We were the mother. We were the soldier, the traitor, the priest. We are all names unspoken. We are Kestrel." I could feel the urn pulling at me. Holmes stood frozen at the edge of the circle. He turned to me. "Watson," he called, barely audible over the mounting hum. "She's the gate, not the vessel." "What?" "The urn isn't the end, it's the means. They've turned her into a mirror. If they complete the rite, she will not release the souls within the urn. She will absorb us all." The silver-masked man stepped forward and held up a dagger, ancient, curved, glimmering with symbols I could not read. Holmes didn't hesitate. He leapt forward, seized the dagger mid-air and wrenched it from the man's grasp. For a moment, everything stopped. The masked acolytes did not react. Lydia simply looked at Holmes. "I remember your name," she said, "but not your soul." Holmes responded, not with words, but with the key. He turned and ran to the base of the amphitheatre, where, hidden beneath a false slab, lay the last lock, the true reliquary. He jammed the key into the stone, and twisted. The earth shuddered. Wind screamed from below. The circle broke, half the masked figures thrown backward by an invisible force. A cyclone of sound tore upward from the opened vault, and the sky fractured. Light and shadow spiraled into the heavens, but instead of freedom the souls screamed. They were not being released, they were being torn apart. The urn trembled violently in my hands. Holmes turned and shouted, "Throw it in!" I hesitated. "What if it—" "Watson, do it now!" I hurled the urn into the chasm. It disappeared with a sound like cracking bone. The sky went silent. Lydia collapsed. Holmes caught her. The circle was gone. So was the silver-masked figure. Only ash remained. We spent the night in the ruins, tending to Lydia. Though it quickly became apparent she was no longer fully present, she recognized nothing, not even her own name. Her speech was fragmented, her memories hollow. Whether from trauma or ritual, her identity was unanchored. "She was a doorway," Holmes said quietly as we built a fire, "and the price of being a door is never walking through one." We watched her sleep, unsure what would awaken. We returned to Baker Street 2 days later. No word came from the circle, no more masked watchers. The coordinates they left us led nowhere. The amphitheatre itself collapsed hours after we departed. Locals blamed a gas explosion. The official explanation was geology. My Crofts agents ensured the story stayed buried. So did we. Lydia was placed in care under a new name. Holmes arranged it quietly, with funds from one of his countless anonymous accounts. She smiled sometimes, spoke to birds, remembered pieces of poetry. But she never again mentioned Elias, or the urn, or the circle. Holmes visited her once, a single time. He returned shaken. "She said my name," he told me, then asked if I'd taken hers. Weeks passed. One evening, as we sat reading by the fire, Holmes spoke. "You remember the ledger, Watson?" "Of course." "I've been decoding the final passage, the one written in invisible ink." He retrieved the last page and held it to the flame. Words bloomed in pale gold. "One circle ends, another begins. The guest is always within. The mask is not worn. It is grown." He looked at me. "Watson, did you feel anything when you held the urn?" I hesitated. "I remember my father's laugh, but I never heard it in real life." Holmes exhaled slowly. "We are not untouched." He poured himself a measure of brandy and stared into the fire. "The circle is broken, but the crack runs through us now." Section 7. The Echo in the Glass. Spring came early to London that year, though it brought with it no comfort. The fog hung lower over the Thames. The lamplight seemed muted, diluted, as if struggling to remember how to shine. Holmes remained withdrawn, not in his usual post-case way, where he paced the carpet or drowned himself in violin melancholy. No, this was different. He began to spend entire afternoons staring at mirrors, small ones, large ones, even reflective glassware. I caught him once examining the sheen of a spoon as though it held a secret he'd forgotten to ask. He hadn't mentioned Lydia since our return, nor the circle, but I could feel them both, like the weight of unspoken thoughts behind his eyes. One evening, as I prepared a simple supper, Holmes entered the kitchen holding a letter. His fingers trembled slightly, something I had rarely seen. "It's from Lydia." I frowned. "I thought she sent it 2 days ago, or someone did. It arrived this morning." He handed it to me. The envelope was pale blue. The handwriting, delicate and strange. Inside, they took more than memory. They took mirrors of the self. "I've seen her, Watson. She has my hands, but not my voice." The circle was never broken. It turned. The next morning, Holmes vanished. No note, no message. Only the lead box remained, sealed, unopened since the write. I waited 2 days. Then the telegram arrived. "Come to Ashbourne, Old Glassworks alone, -SH. Ashbourne was a quiet town near the border of Staffordshire, once a mining village, now half empty and draped in ivy. I found the glassworks easily, an abandoned factory near the quarry, its iron skeleton bent like a forgotten cathedral. Holmes met me at the gate. He looked thinner, pale. His coat hung looser than usual. "Thank you for coming," he said. There's something I need to show you." We entered the factory together. Inside, the silence was near total. The glass-blower's floor was covered in dust and broken panes. Dozens of mirrors leaned against the far wall, cracked, clouded, warped by time. Holmes led me to a full-length mirror. It was nearly 7 feet tall, wrapped in rotting velvet curtains. "I acquired this from an estate in Suffolk," he said. "They called it the Twin." "Why?" He pulled back the curtain. For a moment I saw nothing wrong. My reflection, Holmes's, but then, in the corner of the glass, movement, not ours. A third shape, masked, barely visible. I turned, nothing behind us. "I've seen her there," Holmes whispered. "Lydia, or a version of her. She watches, not always, but often. And she speaks to me." I stepped away from the glass. "This is madness, Holmes." He did not flinch. "I'm inclined to agree, but the madness has logic." He touched the mirror's surface. I believe the circle didn't vanish. They retreated into this, into glass, into reflections. They live in mimicry, not space. And now they're pushing back. "Why tell me now?" "Because last night," he said, voice low, "I saw myself in the glass." And he blinked before I did. We brought the mirror back to Baker Street that night, covered it, sealed it with wax. Holmes insisted on sleeping in the same room, claiming it was the only way to track the entity's pattern. For 3 nights nothing occurred. On the 4th I awoke to the sound of murmuring. I crept down the stairs. Holmes stood in front of the mirror, unmoving, speaking softly. He did not acknowledge me. I stepped beside him, in the glass, Holmes, and next to him, a second Holmes, younger, sterner, smiling faintly. "Who is that?" I whispered. "The original," Holmes replied, "or perhaps the draft that came before me." He turned slowly toward me. His eyes shimmered. "Watson," he said, "what if I was never me to begin with?" I shook my head. "You are who you choose to be." He blinked. The other Holmes in the glass did not. The next morning, Holmes locked himself in the study. He spoke through the door. "There is one final page in the ledger." I frowned. "I thought you decoded it all." "Not this one," he said. "It's not written in ink. It's written in absence." He passed a piece of parchment beneath the door. I held it to the light. Nothing. Then faintly against the firelight, indentations, like handwriting done without ink. I shaded the page in graphite. Words emerged. "The guest remains. He never left. He waits behind the glass. For someone to let him in." Section 8. The Name That Was Not Given. The graphite-stained page lay before us like a confession from an invisible hand. The words still shimmered in my vision long after I looked away. Holmes stood behind me, unusually quiet. "I've studied every mirror in this house," he said. "None match what we've seen in the glassworks piece. That mirror is not merely reflective, it's recursive. It remembers." He opened a folder of sketches he'd made. Glyphs, diagrams, names scribbled in 5 languages. At the centre of it all, drawn in thick ink, was a shape that filled me with a strange dread. A circle, not closed but twisted, forming a spiral within itself. "The spiral sigil," Holmes said. "It predates the red circle, but appears in all their work. It means identity is iteration, that the self loops, until someone opens the loop." I looked back at the covered mirror. "Are you saying it's alive?" "I'm saying," Holmes replied grimly, "that someone built a prison for identity. and it has waited centuries for the door to be reopened. He paused. And I believe that prison was not made for the circle, but by it. We made preparations that evening. Holmes insisted I remain upstairs during the process, but I refused. "This isn't just a puzzle, Holmes," I said. "It's your mind, and I've watched it long enough to know when it's in danger." He did not argue. Together we uncovered the mirror. This time we wore no masks, no salt rings, no glyphs. Only the truth between us. Holmes approached it slowly. "Who are you?" he asked. The reflection did not speak. Instead, it raised its hand. Holmes did the same. For a moment, they moved in perfect synchrony. Then, as Holmes froze, the other kept moving. It touched the inside of the glass, palm out. Holmes mirrored the gesture, and when their hands met, not upon the surface but within, it happened. A fracture, not physical but perceptual. The room split like an overexposed photograph. I fell backward. When I rose, Holmes was gone. Only the mirror remained, and in it, 2 versions of myself. I awoke hours later in my own bed. The mirror was covered once more. Holmes sat at my bedside, pale and trembling, a glass of brandy in his hand. "I went too far," he said, "and I saw the truth." He looked me in the eyes as though unsure I was real. The circle wasn't destroyed, it was absorbed. The right didn't fail. It completed itself through me. He opened his coat. Inside was the red ledger, but it was blank. Every name they ever wore, gone. And now I carry the space they left behind. I tried to argue, to remind him who he was, but he interrupted me with a question. "What was my mother's name?" I opened my mouth, stopped. I didn't know. I'd never known. He smiled faintly. "Neither do I." He stood, shaky but resolved. "I must return to Cryptwood," he said. "There's one place left. The final mirror. The first mirror." The amphitheatre collapsed. "Not that one," he replied. "There's another, beneath the priory, below the vault." He paused at the door. "If I don't return, Watson, do not come for me." I didn't listen. 2 days later, I followed the path to the priory ruins. The trapdoor in the cellar opened without resistance. I descended into the vault. Everything was as we left it, except the urn, which was shattered. Its shards formed a spiral across the floor, and in the far wall, a new door. Open. Beyond it, a chamber of mirrors. Not literal glass, but obsidian, polished and seamless, circling a dais. On it, Holmes, standing, or not quite. His face was calm, his eyes hollow. "You came," he said. "Of course." He stepped down from the dais, but in the mirrors, he didn't move. "I have one question," he said, "and your answer will determine which of us leaves this room." I braced myself. He leaned close. "What was the first case we ever solved together?" I didn't hesitate. "The Study in Scarlet," I said. "Rach is German for revenge." He smiled. Not the cold smile of a mask, but his smile. He stepped back. The mirrors cracked. And then they turned dark. We emerged together, and neither spoke for hours. Back in London, Holmes packed away the ledgers. He burned the robe he'd retrieved from the vault. He placed the final shard of the urn into a locked drawer and sealed it with wax. He resumed violin practice, took up puzzles again, and stopped staring at mirrors. Weeks later I asked him, "How do we know you're really you?" Holmes looked at me, then at his teacup. "I don't," he said, "but I know you are you." And for now, that is enough. Section 9, Shadows in the Ledger. The days after our encounter in the mirror chamber passed in a surreal haze. Holmes seemed both present and distant, his mind treading paths only he could follow. Yet the mystery pressed on, because the ledgers, though many had been destroyed or rendered blank, still whispered secrets in the margins. One evening, as London's fog thickened outside our window, I noticed a folded scrap tucked between the pages of the final ledger. It was written in a cipher unlike any I had seen. Holmes studied it intently. "This is the work of the original keeper," he said. "Parrish was only a custodian. Someone else wrote this." Together we decoded the message, a warning penned centuries before, hidden beneath layers of obfuscation. Beware the hollow name. When one loses their name, they lose their self. The circle feeds on that loss. Holmes's face darkened. "That's what the rite truly was," he murmured. "Not a release, but a feast." Days later, strange events began to unfold in London. Several men and women reported losing their names, forgetting their own identities for hours, then days. They appeared distant, like shadows of themselves, and could not recall their pasts. Police were baffled. Holmes and I traced the pattern to a mysterious organisation known only as the Custodians, a secret sect rumoured to police memories and identities. We confronted a man named Aldridge, who claimed to be an archivist for the Custodians. "They seek to restore balance," he said coldly. "But the Circle's influence has fractured the very fabric of identity. We are the last barrier." Holmes was unconvinced. "They perpetuate fear," he said. "They hunt those who remember too much." One foggy night, as I returned to Baker Street, I found the door ajar. Inside, the room was ransacked. The ledgers were gone. Holmes was missing. In his place, a note. "The final page turns tonight. The guest awaits." I understood immediately. Holmes had gone to face the Circle alone. I gathered what remained, my revolver, the few clues left behind, and set out toward the Priory ruins. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I prepared to confront the shadows lurking within the widow's ledger's final secret. Section 10, The Last Name. The night was thick with mist as I approached the Priory ruins, heart pounding, every step echoing like a tolling bell in the stillness. Somewhere in the shadows the final secret awaited, the truth behind the Circle, the ledger, and Holmes himself. I entered the hollow shell of the chapel, now crumbling, lit faintly by the moon slipping behind ragged clouds. At its centre, the ancient dais where the rite had nearly come to pass was empty, but for a single figure. Holmes. But he was different. No longer the sharp-eyed detective I knew. His expression was vacant, his eyes reflecting some strange and distant light. Behind him stood the masked figure, the original keeper, the architect of the Circle, draped in a cloak of deep crimson embroidered with swirling spirals. "You came," Holmes said, voice hollow, "just as I hoped." The keeper stepped forward, revealing a face etched with age, eyes glinting with cold fire. "Welcome to the end, Watson." The keeper explained that the Circle was a prison and a salvation, a place where names and identities were stored, preserved, and sometimes sacrificed to maintain a cosmic balance. Holmes had become a vessel, a living ledger, his memories intertwined with countless souls lost and found. "Your friend is trapped within himself," the keeper said. "To free him, you must name him. Call his true name from the abyss." I looked at Holmes. searching for a spark of recognition. "What is your name, Holmes?" I whispered. He looked at me, pain flickering in his gaze, but no answer. Drawing on every memory, every shared moment, I spoke his name aloud. Sherlock Holmes. For a heartbeat the world hung still. Then Holmes blinked, his eyes clearing. The keeper recoiled, his power fracturing. With a sudden roar, the spiral sigil burned bright behind him, then shattered into shards of light. Holmes stepped forward, fully himself once more. "Thank you, Watson." Together we sealed the vault, burying the circle's legacy beneath layers of earth and silence. The ledgers were burned, their secrets lost to smoke and flame. Holmes, shaken but restored, vowed to keep watch for any shadows that might return. As dawn broke over London, I felt hope return to the city and to my friend.